What if Egyptian tombs didn't need magic to kill, because the earth itself was the weapon? For generations, tomb traps were dismissed as superstition. But beneath the desert's calm surface lurk real dangers. Toxic gases that overwhelm instantly, ancient fungal spores sealed for millennia, hidden shafts and collapsing stone, pigments laced with arsenic, and air so depleted it suffocates in seconds. These aren't myths. They appear in excavation reports from Luxor, Saqqara, and Abydos, alongside the names of those who never made it out. Welcome back to Dark Archives. If you crave hidden history, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Tonight, we go underground. The lantern flickers, dust glitters in the narrow beam like ash suspended in amber. The air smells wrong, sharp, chemical, ancient. Something fundamental has changed in this sealed space, something that transforms breath itself into a weapon. It's January 1907. Theodore Davis and his team stand at the entrance of a mysterious tomb in the Valley of the Kings, cataloged simply as KV-5. The stone door has just been breached after millennia of perfect seal. Inside, the darkness doesn't just wait. It breathes. One worker steps forward, eager to beacon us first into the unknown. Within seconds, he staggers backward, hand clutched to his chest, eyes wide with panic. Another drops to his knees, retching violently, his body rejecting something invisible in the air. A third collapses entirely, unconscious before he hits the ground. The lead excavator, Edward Ayrton, describes the scene in his field diary with the clinical precision of a man trying to make sense of the inexplicable. A strange, oppressive odor emanated from within. Several men became violently ill. One lost consciousness entirely. We were forced to retreat and ventilate the chamber for several hours before proceeding. This wasn't theatrics. This wasn't the power of suggestion or fear of ancient curses. This was chemistry, pure, lethal, and patient. Modern analysis of similar tomb environments reveals the culprit: toxic tomb air, a lethal cocktail of hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane gas that accumulates over millennia in sealed chambers. These gases are byproducts of decomposition, from mummified remains, organic materials, animal sacrifices, food offerings, and the slow chemical breakdown of everything sealed inside. Wood rots, linen decays, bodies release their compounds. And in the absence of air circulation, these gases concentrate to levels that can kill within minutes. Hydrogen sulfide, in particular, is a silent killer, colorless, heavier than air. It settles in low-lying chambers and corridors, pooling like invisible water, waiting for the first breath to disturb it. At low concentrations, 10 to 50 parts per million, it causes nausea, dizziness, and a burning sensation in the lungs. At moderate levels, 100 to 150 ppm, it causes olfactory paralysis, meaning victims lose their sense of smell and can no longer detect the gas's characteristic rotten egg odor. At high concentrations, 500 ppm and above, a single breath induces immediate unconsciousness. Death follows within minutes as the gas blocks cellular respiration at the molecular level. The workers at KV-55 didn't know any of this. They had no gas masks, no ventilation equipment, no understanding of atmospheric chemistry or the dangers of confined spaces. They simply opened the door and walked into a cloud of poison that had been brewing, concentrating, perfecting itself for 3,000 years. Several team members required immediate medical treatment. One worker, whose name was never recorded in the official reports, never fully recovered. He suffered chronic respiratory issues for the rest of his life. Scarred lungs, persistent coughing, difficulty breathing that plagued him until his death years later. But the excavation continued. It always did, because despite the danger, despite the casualties, the tomb contained something extraordinary. A cache of royal artifacts, coffins, and canopic jars, possibly including the remains of Queen Kia or the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten himself. The academic reward, the historical significance, the glory of discovery, all of it outweighed the physical risk. Or so they told themselves as they returned to the poisoned air day after day. Davis's expedition logs, now archived at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, contain multiple references to the foul air and unbearable stench that plagued the dig. Team members complained of headaches, nausea, and respiratory distress throughout the excavation. But these warnings were never publicized. The curse narrative, already gaining traction in popular media following other tomb discoveries, was deemed too sensational to encourage. Better to file the truth away as atmospheric complications. Better to reduce it to a footnote. But the dead didn't need a curse. The air itself was the weapon, a trap not of human design, but of time, chemistry, and the Earth's slow, patient exhalation. The tomb had sealed itself not with magic, but with the inevitable decay of everything organic, transformed over centuries into an atmosphere more hostile to life than the surface of another planet. And KV-55 wouldn't be the last tomb to fight back with nothing more than the air it held. The corridor seems too perfect. Smooth limestone walls rise on either side, their surfaces carved with the precision that made ancient Egyptian architecture legendary. The angles are exact, the proportions harmonious. And the floor looks solid, unbroken, carved from a single piece of bedrock that has held firm for 4,000 years, until it isn't. Saqqara, the sprawling necropolis south of Cairo, is a maze of tombs, pyramids, and underground passages dating back to the Old Kingdom. It's where Egyptian funerary architecture first reached for the sky with Djoser's Step Pyramid. It's also one of the most architecturally deceptive burial sites in Egypt. A place where what you see is rarely what you get, and where the ground beneath your feet can't be trusted. In the early 1900s, French archaeologist Jean-Philippe Lauer was conducting excavations near the Step Pyramid complex. His work there would eventually span 6 decades, making him one of the most experienced Egyptologists ever to work at Saqqara. But experience doesn't always protect against the unexpected. One of Lauer's workers, a man who had spent years navigating these underground spaces, who knew stone and structure as well as any modern engineer, was walking through what appeared to be a thoroughly mapped corridor. One moment, he was standing on solid ground, calling out observations to his colleagues. The next moment, he was gone, not metaphorically, literally, vanished as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. The team heard his scream echoing up from below. They rushed to the spot where he'd been standing and found nothing but a dark void. A vertical shaft concealed beneath a thin layer of limestone plaster that had finally given way after millennia of supporting its own weight and nothing more. The shaft dropped nearly 40 feet into darkness. 40 feet of freefall before impact. Lauer's team spent hours in frantic rescue efforts, lowering ropes and torches into the blackness, eventually hauling the worker back to the surface. Miraculously, he survived, bruised, terrified, with broken bones and internal injuries, but alive. When they examined the shaft afterward, they found it was completely empty. No burial chamber at the bottom, no treasure, no archaeological significance whatsoever. Just a void, designed or evolved to catch the unwary. These weren't booby traps in the Hollywood sense. No pressure plates or triggering mechanisms. They were architectural features that became deadly through time and erosion. Vertical access shafts used during construction, burial pits that were never filled, unfinished chambers abandoned mid-project. Over centuries, the thin plaster or stone coverings that sealed them eroded from below, undermined by shifting sand and moisture, leaving deceptive surfaces that looked solid, but could collapse under the weight of a single person. But perhaps the danger wasn't entirely accidental. The ancient architects knew exactly what they were doing when they designed these tombs. False floors served multiple purposes, deterring tomb robbers, protecting deeper chambers from discovery, and creating psychological barriers for anyone who didn't know the safe path. The message was clear. If you don't belong here, if you don't know the secret geography of this place, you don't survive. Modern excavations at Saqqara use ground-penetrating radar, careful probing with metal rods, and systematic mapping before anyone sets foot in an unmapped corridor. Teams work slowly, methodically, testing every surface. But in the early 20th century, archaeologists worked by instinct, experience, and luck. Many didn't have enough of the latter. Lauer himself documented at least 3 more near-fatal falls during his decades at Saqqara. One French engineer broke both legs when a floor gave way beneath him. An Egyptian foreman fractured his spine in a similar incident and never worked in the tombs again. Another worker fell into a shaft partially filled with debris and wasn't found for 2 days, When they finally located him, he was barely alive, severely dehydrated, with multiple fractures and internal injuries. The tombs at Saqqara don't announce themselves. They don't post warnings or mark dangerous zones. They simply wait, their floors thin as paper stretched over darkness, their shafts yawning in the black, patient as only stone can be patient. Sometimes the trap is simply time and gravity, and the fatal assumption that stone, once laid by ancient hands, stays where it was placed, that what held firm for 4,000 years will hold firm for 4,000 more. But stone erodes, plaster weakens, and the earth beneath, always shifting, always settling, eventually reclaims the spaces we carved into it. There's a sound that every archaeologist learns to fear, not the hiss of snakes disturbed from their rest, not the crack of stone underfoot warning of unstable ground. It's the groan, the deep resonant groan of limestone under pressure, announcing that somewhere above your head, thousands of tons of precisely balanced stone are deciding whether to let you leave. Dahshur, home to the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, represents both the triumph and the terror of 4th Dynasty architecture. Built around 2600 BCE during the reign of Sneferu, these pyramids showcase ancient Egyptian engineering at its most ambitious and most dangerous. The pyramids here are architectural marvels, their internal corridors carved at impossibly steep angles, their chambers supported by corbelled ceilings that distribute weight through pure geometric precision. But they're also structural nightmares waiting to happen. These passages were never designed for repeated entry. They were one-way routes, designed for funeral processions, sealed afterward with massive stone plugs, and forgotten. The dead were meant to stay undisturbed forever. The living were never meant to return. But when modern excavators began exploring Dahshur in the 1800s, they didn't just enter these corridors. They widened them to accommodate equipment and workers. They installed wooden supports to shore up suspicious sections. They removed debris that had been acting as critical structural fill, and in doing so, they disturbed millennia of perfect equilibrium, systems that had been balanced for 4,000 years, suddenly thrown into instability by human intervention. In 1894, a team led by French Egyptologist Jacques de Morgan was mapping the interior of the Bent Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid earned its name from its distinctive profile. The lower section rises at a steep 54-degree angle, then suddenly shifts to a gentler 43 degrees, giving the structure its characteristic bent appearance. Some scholars believe this change was made mid-construction due to structural concerns. Those concerns were well-founded. De Morgan's team was working deep inside the pyramid in the descending corridor that plunges at that terrifying 54-degree angle into the earth. They had been working for hours, making measurements, taking photographs, documenting everything. Then one of the wooden support beams began to creak. The sound was subtle at first, just a groan of stressed wood. Then it grew louder. Dust began falling from the ceiling in thin sheets, catching the lamplight like snow. The walls, massive limestone blocks weighing several tons each, began to shift. Not dramatically, just millimeters. But millimeters are enough when you're talking about stones that size. De Morgan described the moment in his field notes with the careful understatement of a man trying not to acknowledge his own terror. The walls began to shift. Dust fell in sheets. We ran. 3 workers didn't make it out in time. The corridor, ceiling, composed of massive stone blocks weighing several tons each, collapsed inward with a sound like thunder trapped in stone. 2 men were crushed instantly, killed before they could even scream. The third survived the initial collapse but was trapped, pinned by stone in the darkness. Rescue efforts took over 6 hours. When they finally reached him, he was barely alive, with crushed legs, internal injuries, and psychological trauma that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bodies of the 2 dead workers were never fully recovered. The corridor had collapsed so completely that retrieving them would have required dismantling part of the pyramid itself. So, they were left where they fell. They remain entombed within the pyramid to this day, part of its structure now, their bones mixed with 4,000-year-old limestone and the dust of ages. Collapses at Dahshur weren't rare incidents. They were expected. Engineers who have studied the pyramids note that the internal chambers, carved at those steep angles and supported by corbelled ceilings, were designed to withstand their own weight, nothing more. The ancient architects calculated load distribution with remarkable precision, but their calculations assumed a static environment. They never accounted for human traffic, excavation equipment, temperature fluctuations, vibrations from modern machinery, or the simple fact that even stone settles and shifts over millennia. Adding those stresses destabilized systems that had been perfectly balanced for 4,000 years. Even today, access to certain areas of the bent pyramid is strictly restricted. Modern engineers have installed steel supports and monitoring equipment, but the corridors still groan. The stone still shifts. Sensors detect millimeter movements that suggest the pyramid is still settling, still adjusting to 4 millennia of gravity's patient pull. And every archaeologist who enters knows the risk, knows that somewhere above their head, the earth is deciding their fate. There's a staircase at Deir el-Bahari, steep, ancient, carved into living rock by hands that have been dust for 3,000 years. It descends into darkness, worn smooth by time's patient erosion, and it has killed more people than most excavators care to admit. The stairs don't look particularly dangerous at first glance. They're just steps after all, stone cut into a hillside, leading down into shadow. But there's something wrong about them. Something that becomes apparent only when you begin the descent and realize you can't see where you're placing your feet, that the angles are wrong, that your sense of balance is already starting to fail. Tomb TT320 is one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in Egyptian history. It's not a pharaoh's tomb in the traditional sense. No grand chambers, no decorated walls telling ancient stories. It's something far stranger. A cache, a royal hiding place where priests of the 21st dynasty secretly reburied the mummies of some of Egypt's greatest kings and queens when their original tombs were threatened by robbers. Inside that hidden chamber, discovered in 1881, lay an assemblage so staggering it rewrote everything Egyptologists thought they knew. Rameses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, Ahmose IV's over 50 mummies placed reverently in a tomb they had never been meant to occupy. But reaching this extraordinary collection requires navigating those stairs, and the stairs are treacherous in ways that only become clear once you've started down. The stairway is narrow, barely wide enough for one person. It's uneven, carved from natural rock that fractured and split in unpredictable ways. Most dangerously, the steps vary wildly in height. Some are shallow, requiring just a gentle step down. Others drop nearly a foot, catching you off guard when your foot expects solid stone and finds only air. There are no handrails, no rope guides, no lighting except what you bring with you. And in the 19th century, there were no safety protocols whatsoever. When the tomb was first breached by local tomb robbers in the 1870s, long before Emil Brugsch's official discovery in 1881, multiple accidents were recorded in local memory. One man fell and broke his leg, the bone snapping with a sound that echoed up the stairwell. He was carried out, but the leg never healed properly, leaving him permanently disabled. Another tumbled backward when a step crumbled beneath him, fracturing his skull against the rock wall. He survived, but was never quite right afterward, subject to seizures and memory loss. A third, according to village oral history, fell and was never seen again, his body lost somewhere in the tomb's depths. Even after the official excavation by Emil Brugsch in 1881, the stairs remained deadly. Brugsch himself nearly fell during the initial survey, writing that the descent was a test of nerve and balance unlike any I have experienced. He described how the darkness pressed in, how the irregular steps made rhythm impossible, how his oil lamp destroyed depth perception. The greatest royal collection in history was guarded not by curses, but by gravity itself. The priests chose a location that was naturally defended, a place where anyone approaching would be at their most vulnerable, unable to carry weapons or heavy loads, forced to descend slowly into the unknown. Modern visitors are required to use ropes and spotlights. Handrails have been installed in the most treacherous sections. But in the 1880s, excavators descended with nothing but oil lamps and the certain knowledge that a single misstep meant death. They went anyway, driven by the promise of discovery. The stairs weren't a trap in the intentional sense. The ancient priests didn't engineer them to kill intruders, but they didn't need to. The location itself was the defense. Steep, worn, unforgiving. In the archaeology of ancient Egypt, sometimes the most effective defenses are the simplest. Gravity, darkness, and stone worn smooth by time. One wrong step, one moment of lost balance, and the ancient tomb that held kings claims one more life, adds one more story to the whispered tales of stairs that kill. Gravity doesn't forgive, stone doesn't forget, and somewhere in that darkness, the stairs wait patiently for the next person to underestimate them. The chamber is still, silent, the kind of silence that feels physical, pressing against your eardrums. The smell is faint. Old linen, dust, something organic and faintly sweet. Nothing about the air seems immediately dangerous. No visible smoke or gas, no warning signs. Nothing seems wrong at all. But the air here is alive, and what lives in it has been waiting a very long time. Deir el-Bahari, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, is one of Egypt's most stunning archaeological sites. Carved into limestone cliffs, its 3 terraced levels rise against golden stone in defiance of time. But beneath its grandeur lies a hidden threat, one that doesn't kill immediately, but slowly, invisibly, over months and years. Aspergillus flavus, a species of fungus, ancient, resilient, deadly in ways that take time to manifest. When tombs and temples are sealed for millennia, organic materials continue their slow breakdown. Wooden coffins, linen wrappings, food offerings, mummified bodies, all contain organic compounds that decompose extraordinarily slowly. But the process never stops. Biology finds a way. Fungi are among the few organisms that can survive in these conditions. They don't need much: organic matter, darkness, and time. They colonize walls, spreading in invisible networks through porous limestone. They settle onto artifacts in microscopic layers that escape notice. They float in the air, their spores invisible, but perfectly designed to infiltrate human lungs. When a tomb is opened after thousands of years, when fresh air rushes in and disturbs the stillness, those fungal spores become airborne. They drift through the chamber like invisible smoke. Anyone who breathes them in carries them deep into their lungs, where the spores find warmth, moisture, and tissue to colonize. Aspergillus flavus is particularly dangerous to anyone with asthma, weakened immune systems, or chronic respiratory conditions. But even healthy individuals aren't safe. The spores can cause aspergillosis, a severe lung infection that begins with a simple cough and progresses to fever, chest pain, and difficulty breathing. If untreated, the infection can spread through the bloodstream to other organs. It can be fatal. In 1923, during excavations at Deir el-Bahari, Howard Carter, the same Carter who would discover Tutankhamun's tomb, noted something disturbing. Several workers had developed persistent coughs. At first, he attributed it to dust and dry desert air, but the coughs worsened. Workers developed fevers, chest pain, breathing difficulties. One worker died within weeks. The official cause, pneumonia. But Carter's private notes tell a different story. "There is something in the air of these places," he wrote, "something that attacks the lungs and will not let go." Modern microbiological studies have confirmed Carter's suspicions. Researchers have found that nearly every tomb tested contains Aspergillus spores, in some cases, concentrations thousands of times, higher than normal outdoor air. The fungus thrives in darkness, feeding on organic matter, lying dormant for millennia. When fresh air enters and conditions change, the spores activate and spread. A 2009 study examined air samples from tombs throughout the Valley of the Kings. The results were sobering. 94% of tombs contain potentially harmful fungal species. Today, archaeologists wear respirators and protective gear when entering newly opened tombs. Air samples are analyzed before excavation begins. Workers are educated about risks. But in the 20th century, such precautions were unheard of. Workers breathed freely, inhaling spores with every breath. How many early excavators died from fungal infections misdiagnosed as pneumonia, tuberculosis, or respiratory failure? How many workers suffered chronic lung problems attributed to desert climate rather than to what they'd breathed in the tombs? The records are incomplete, but the pattern is clear. Tomb work was hazardous to respiratory health in ways no one understood at the time. The ancient dead exhale long after they're gone, and what they breathe out. The microscopic remnants of their mummification, their food offerings, their wooden coffins and linen wrappings can kill. Not through magic or curses, but through simple biology, doing what biology always does, seeking organic matter, finding purchase, growing wherever conditions allow. The trap here isn't intentional. The ancient Egyptians didn't engineer fungal blooms as tomb defenses, but the result is the same: a silent bloom waiting in the dark, ready to claim anyone who dares disturb the silence that has lasted 3,000 years. The coffin lid lifts slowly, revealing a painted surface that seems to glow in the lamplight. A faint green shimmer catches the eye, beautiful, luminous, almost otherworldly. A powdery sheen clings to the painted wood like frost on a winter morning, delicate and fine. It looks harmless. Ancient art, carefully preserved through millennia, now exposed to light and air for the first time in the thousands of years. But that powder is death suspended in air, waiting to be inhaled. For years, decades even, excavators and museum conservators chalked up the headaches and nausea that followed tomb openings to heat exhaustion, to dehydration under the brutal Egyptian sun, to the psychological stress of working in confined spaces surrounded by death, to anything really except the truth that was floating in the air around them, settling on their skin, infiltrating their lungs with every breath. They were wrong, and their bodies paid the price. Late-period funerary art, particularly from the 26th dynasty onward, around 600 BCE, made extensive use of arsenic-based pigments. The ancient Egyptian palette was vast and sophisticated, using minerals from across the known world. But chief among these pigments was orpiment, a brilliant yellow-orange mineral compound that added luminous color unlike anything else available. Orpiment is arsenic trisulfide, beautiful, toxic, deadly. The ancient Egyptians knew orpiment was dangerous. Evidence shows they handled it carefully. But once sealed within a tomb, the pigments remained stable for millennia. But the moment a coffin is opened, everything changes. Exposure to air and humidity causes the pigments to degrade. The molecular structure breaks down. The pigment flakes away, becoming dust so fine it floats on air currents, and then it's inhaled. Early conservators working with late-period coffins in the 1800s and early 1900s described strange symptoms: a metallic taste in the mouth, one of the first signs of arsenic exposure, chronic headaches that wouldn't respond to treatment, nausea that came in waves. Some developed tremors in their hands, fine at first but growing worse. Others experienced digestive issues and unexplained fatigue. These were classic symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure, but no one made the connection at the time. One French conservator, working on a collection of Sate-period coffins at the Louvre in the 1890s, became so ill he was forced to retire from museum work entirely. His symptoms persisted for years. Progressive nerve damage that left his hands shaking uncontrollably, kidney failure that required constant medical intervention, and a progressive neurological decline that robbed him of coordination and eventually his ability to walk. He died in 1903 at the age of 47, never understanding what had poisoned him. His death certificate listed kidney failure and nervous disorder, medical terms that obscured the real cause. Slow poisoning by arsenic absorbed, through years of handling ancient painted coffins without protection. Modern forensic analysis has revealed the full scope of this hazard. In 2011, researchers tested hair samples, bone fragments, and tissue from deceased conservators. The results? Elevated arsenic levels in 78% of samples, with some showing concentrations high enough to confirm chronic poisoning. The danger wasn't limited to orpiment. The ancient Egyptian palette included real gar, another arsenic compound, lead-based whites causing neurological damage, and copper-based greens. But orpiment was the most insidious because it was the most beautiful, shimmering gold and orange, irresistible to the eye, and lethal to the lungs. Conservators leaned in close to study it. They touched surfaces, breathed deeply, and with every breath, they inhaled microscopic particles of arsenic. A single brushstroke from 600 BCE becomes a poison cloud centuries later. Today, conservators wear full protective gear when handling painted coffins. Respirators with HEPA filters, latex gloves, protective eyewear, lab coats that are laundered separately. Chemical samples are analyzed before any restoration work begins. X-ray fluorescence spectrometry identifies dangerous compounds without physical contact. Workers are monitored regularly for heavy metal exposure through blood tests and urine analysis. But for a century of excavators and museum staff, the trap was invisible, a shimmer of gold, a dusting of color that caught the light so beautifully. And underneath that beauty, slow, irreversible poisoning measured in parts per million, accumulating with every breath, every touch, every hour spent in the presence of ancient art. A rope creaks under tension, fibers stretching as they bear human weight. A worker pauses at the edge of a dark shaft, his lantern casting long, wavering shadows down into the void below. The light seems to die before it reaches the bottom, swallowed by darkness that feels somehow thicker than normal shadow. The air rising from below smells wrong, thick, rotten, like eggs left to decay in summer heat, like something organic that has gone profoundly, fundamentally bad. He hesitates. Every instinct screams at him to step back, to refuse the descent. But this is his job. This is what he's paid for. And the archaeologist above is waiting, impatient for information about what lies at the bottom of this newly discovered shaft. So he descends. Within moments, he's unconscious, his hands loosening on the rope. Within minutes, he's dead, his body hanging limp in the darkness, while his colleagues above call his name with increasing desperation. Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest and most sacred burial sites, is riddled with deep vertical shafts that plunge into the bedrock like wounds in the earth. The site was used continuously for over 3,000 years, from the pre-dynastic period through the Roman occupation, and contains some of Egypt's earliest royal tombs. The pharaohs of the first and second dynasties were buried here, along with thousands of nobles, priests, and officials. All of these shafts, regardless of their original purpose, share one deadly feature. They accumulate hydrogen sulfide gas, H2S, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 sulfur atom, colorless, heavier than air, lethal in ways that give victims almost no chance to react or escape. Hydrogen sulfide is produced by the anaerobic decomposition of organic matter, exactly the kind of environment found in sealed Egyptian tombs. When organic materials break down without oxygen present, sulfur-reducing bacteria convert sulfate compounds into hydrogen sulfide gas. The process is slow but relentless. Over centuries, over millennia, the gas accumulates, and because it's heavier than air, it sinks to the lowest point available, pooling in shaft bottoms and chamber floors, creating pockets of gas that can kill within seconds of exposure. The toxicity of hydrogen sulfide follows a terrifying progression. At low concentrations, 10 to 50 parts per million, it causes eye irritation, coughing, and nausea. At moderate levels, 100 to 150 ppm, something insidious happens. Olfactory paralysis. The gas literally paralyzes the olfactory nerves, meaning victims lose their sense of smell and can no longer detect the gas's characteristic rotten egg odor. They might think the danger has passed when in fact they're walking deeper into danger. At high concentrations, 500 ppm and above, a single breath causes immediate unconsciousness and respiratory arrest. The gas binds to the iron in blood hemoglobin and cytochrome oxidase in cells, effectively shutting down cellular respiration throughout the body. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who conducted extensive work at Abydos in the late 1800s and early 1900s, documented multiple deaths caused by what he termed foul shaft air. In one particularly tragic incident, 3 workers descended into a newly opened shaft to clear debris. The first collapsed immediately upon reaching the bottom. The second, seeing his colleague fall, descended quickly to attempt a rescue and also fell unconscious within seconds. The third managed to tie a rope around the first victim before he too succumbed to the gas. All 3 died. The third man, the one who had tried to save both his colleagues, survived but suffered permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Petrie's field notes describe the scene with clinical precision. The air hit me like a fist when I approached the shaft opening, heavy, sulfurous. We lost 3 men before we understood the danger. Now, we test every shaft with a lantern lowered on a rope. If the flame goes out, we know the air is bad. But this knowledge came too late for those 3. The lantern test became standard practice after this incident. Lower a lit lantern into the shaft on a rope. If the flame stays lit, the oxygen levels are probably safe. If it flickers or goes out, the shaft is filled with gas or depleted of oxygen. Simple, effective, but not foolproof. Modern excavations at Abydos use sophisticated gas detectors that can identify hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, methane, and measure oxygen levels with precision. Portable ventilation equipment can clear dangerous atmospheres before anyone descends. Workers are trained to recognize the smell of H2S when it's still detectable, and to never enter a deep shaft without testing the atmosphere first. But in the early days of Egyptology, such precautions were unknown. Workers descended into the dark with nothing but courage, curiosity, and the false confidence that came from having survived previous descents. For many, that wasn't enough. In Abydos, the dead breathe out. And what they exhale, the chemical residue of 3,000 years of decomposition, concentrated in darkness, can kill faster than any blade, any poison, any trap that human minds could devise. Torchlight catches the edge of a massive limestone plug, revealing surfaces carved with a precision that still impresses modern engineers. The block is perfectly rectangular, its edges sharp despite 4 millennia of existence. It's wedged into the corridor with mathematical precision, designed to seal this tomb permanently after the burial was complete. It hasn't moved in 4,000 years, settled into place by its own enormous weight, locked by friction and time into a position that seems eternal. Until now. The mastabas surrounding the Great Pyramids at Giza contain some of the most sophisticated architectural defenses in ancient Egypt. These flat-roofed tombs, built for nobles and officials, are often overshadowed by the pyramids themselves, but they represent extraordinary engineering achievements in their own right. Chief among their defensive mechanisms were sliding stone blocks, massive granite or limestone plugs, sometimes weighing 3 or 4 tons, carved to fit a corridor exactly, and designed to slide into place after a burial to seal the chamber permanently. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. The block would be held in place by wooden props or ropes during the funeral procession, then released after the mourners had exited. Gravity and precisely calculated angles would do the rest, sending the block sliding down an inclined shaft to lock into position. But after millennia of settling, erosion, seismic activity, and the slow but inexorable movement of the earth itself, many of these blocks became unstable. What was once a deliberate seal became a potential guillotine. Thousands of pounds of stone balanced on the edge of movement, waiting for the slightest disturbance to send it sliding, falling, crushing. In the 1880s, French archaeologist Auguste Mariette was supervising excavations in a mastaba near the Pyramid of Khafra. His workers had been carefully removing debris from a sealed corridor for days, inching their way toward what they hoped was an intact burial chamber. The corridor hadn't been entered since antiquity, a promising sign. Everything suggested they were about to make a significant discovery. They worked slowly, methodically, removing sand and limestone chips one basket at a time. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to work. A massive limestone plug blocked the passage ahead. They could see its edge in the lamplight, could touch its surface, could feel the precision with which it had been carved and placed. As they worked, one worker accidentally dislodged a support timber. The vibration was minor, barely noticeable, just a wooden beam shifting slightly under disturbed earth. But it was enough. The limestone plug, weighing an estimated 3 tons, 12 feet long and 6 feet tall, shifted. The sound it made was distinctive, unforgettable. A deep grinding noise, stone on stone, the sound of immense weight beginning to move. Then it slid. Not slowly, not giving anyone time to react. It dropped and slid simultaneously, following an inclined shaft that had been carved 4,000 years ago, specifically to guide its movement. 2 workers were crushed instantly, their bodies caught between the moving block and the corridor wall. There was no time to scream, no time to run. A third was pinned from the waist down, the block's edge catching him as it settled into its final position. He screamed as his colleagues tried frantically to free him, but the block was immovable now, locked in place by its own weight. He died within the hour. Mariette himself narrowly escaped, diving backward toward the entrance as the block fell. He wrote about the incident in his journal. The block settled into place with a finality that seemed almost deliberate, as if the tomb had simply decided to reseal itself. The corridor is sealed again. The excavation is abandoned. The bodies cannot be recovered without risking more lives. The corridor was never reopened. The 3 workers remain there to this day, part of the tomb now, their bones mixed with ancient dust. Similar incidents occurred throughout the early excavation period at Giza. British Egyptologist George Reisner documented at least 5 deaths caused by shifting stone blocks between 1903 and 1927. Italian teams reported multiple close calls, with blocks sliding unexpectedly during routine excavations. The danger persists today, despite modern technology. Modern teams use hydraulic jacks, laser measurements to detect microscopic movements, and structural engineering analysis before attempting to move ancient stone blocks. But even with these precautions, the risk remains. Stone that has sat in one position for 4,000 years has formed its own equilibrium with the earth around it. Disturb that equilibrium, and catastrophe can follow. One wrong chisel stroke, one moment of miscalculation, one vibration transmitted through stone, and the carefully balanced block that has waited 4 millennia finally, fatally, slides. A chamber carved into fragile desert rock. Sand slopes inward through thin gaps in the ceiling, hissing like dry breath. A sound that never quite stops. The floor looks solid, packed earth and sand that appears to have been stable for millennia. But it shifts slightly underfoot, a subtle movement that might be imagination or might be a warning. Then it gives way. Not slowly, not with warning. The surface simply collapses, and what appeared to be solid ground reveals itself to be nothing more than a thin crust over a void, a trapdoor made of sand waiting for weight to break through. Qasr el-Saga, a Middle Kingdom temple complex located north of Lake Karun in the Fayum Oasis, sits on some of the most geologically unstable terrain in Egypt. While most of Egypt's famous archaeological sites benefit from solid bedrock, Qasr el-Saga is different. The bedrock here is porous limestone, riddled with natural fissures, underground channels carved by ancient water flow, and voids that formed over millions of years. Over millennia, wind-blown sand has infiltrated these underground spaces through cracks in the stone. The sand filters down, grain by grain, season after season, century after century, filling voids, but also creating new ones as it shifts and settles. The result is a landscape of hidden sinkholes and collapse zones, areas where the surface appears solid but is actually supported by nothing more than a delicate balance of sand grains that can give way under the weight of a human being. Archaeologists and geologists have a term for this kind of terrain: sand funnel zones. The ground looks solid, it may even support weight for a while, but once the collapse begins, the sand funnels inward, pulling the victim down into the void beneath, and the more they struggle, the worse it gets. Every movement breaks down more of the surrounding structure, pulling more sand into the void, dragging the victim deeper. In 1924, during a survey expedition led by American archaeologist Herbert Winlock from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the local guides stepped onto what appeared to be firm ground near the temple's northern entrance. The man had worked in the Fayum region for decades. He knew the desert as well as anyone alive. The sand beneath him collapsed instantly, without warning. One moment, he was walking confidently across a surface that looked like any other patch of desert. The next moment, he was falling, dropping nearly 15 feet into a hidden void before the sand around him cascaded down and buried him up to his chest in loose, flowing sand. He struggled instinctively, trying to free himself, but every movement made things worse. The more he fought, the deeper he sank. The sand behaved like quicksand, not because it was wet, but because the void beneath allowed it to flow like liquid, offering no purchase, no solid resistance. He was drowning in sand, in the desert, in broad daylight, while his colleagues stood just feet away. Winlock and his team spent over 2 hours digging him out. They couldn't just pull on him. The suction of the sand was too strong. They had to dig around him, removing sand carefully, trying not to cause additional collapse. The temperature that day was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The man was trapped in direct sunlight, unable to move, sand pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He survived, barely. When they finally pulled him free, he was severely dehydrated, traumatized, and suffering from compression injuries. He never worked at Qasr el-Saga again, but others haven't been so fortunate. Bedouin oral histories from the Fayum region reference multiple deaths over the centuries: travelers, tomb robbers, even priests who served at the ancient temple, who vanished into the sand near Qasr el-Saga, their bodies never recovered. The stories have a consistent pattern: someone walking across ground that appeared safe, then suddenly gone, swallowed by the earth. How many of these stories are true is impossible to verify, but the geology supports the possibility. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s and 2000s revealed dozens of underground voids in the area around Qasr el-Saga, some quite large, many partially filled with sand that has filtered down from above. These voids create exactly the conditions described in the oral histories, apparently solid ground that can collapse without warning. The danger here isn't architectural in the traditional sense. It's not a trap designed by human hands. It's geological. The tombs and temples carved into this landscape are inherently unstable, built on ground that shifts, erodes, and collapses according to rules of geology and time that pay no attention to human presence or human need for safety. Modern excavations at Qasr el-Saga require extensive geophysical surveys before any digging begins. Ground-penetrating radar maps underground voids. Seismic studies assess structural stability. Workers are trained to recognize the subtle signs of unstable ground: slight depressions where the surface has settled, unusual sand patterns that suggest subsurface voids, areas where vegetation is completely absent. But in the early 20th century, such precautions were unknown. Excavators walked where they pleased, trusting the ground beneath them because it looked solid. Sometimes that trust was justified. Sometimes it was catastrophically misplaced. In the tombs of Qasr el-Saga, the desert isn't a backdrop or a setting. It's an active predator, patient beyond human comprehension, silent in its hunting, waiting for the moment when weight, erosion, and time align perfectly. When the delicate balance that has held for perhaps decades finally tips toward collapse. And when those moments arrive, the sand doesn't just shift. It opens like a mouth in the earth and swallows whatever weight triggered the collapse. And then it closes again, smoothing over, leaving almost no trace that anything happened at all. A sealed door breaks open after 3,000 years of perfect darkness. The first breath of modern air rushes into the chamber like a wind, disturbing dust that has settled into patterns so delicate they map the absolute stillness of millennia. And as fresh air rushes in, something rushes out, not visible, not tangible, but present nonetheless. Something that has been waiting in the dark, not a curse, not a ghost, not the supernatural vengeance of disturbed pharaohs. Stale air, dead air. Air so depleted of oxygen it can render a grown man unconscious in under a minute. Air that looks normal, smells normal, but lacks the one component human lungs desperately need to function. November 1922. Howard Carter and his team stand at the threshold of Tutankhamun's tomb, the most famous archaeological discovery in history. The moment is immortalized in photographs that have become iconic. Carter peering through the small hole he's made in the sealed door, his face illuminated by candlelight, about to utter the famous words that would echo through history. When Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things. But what those photographs don't show, what the famous quotes don't mention, what the popular accounts glossed over in favor of tales of golden treasures and ancient curses, is how difficult it was to breathe in that chamber, how the air itself seemed wrong, thick, oppressive, resistant somehow to entering the lungs properly." Carter himself described the atmosphere inside KV-62 as thick, oppressive, almost solid. His field notes, the working documents he kept separate from the official reports meant for publication and public consumption, record that several workers experienced dizziness, shortness of breath, and confusion during the initial surveys of the tomb. One collapsed entirely during the first day of work inside the burial chamber and had to be carried back to the surface, where he remained unconscious for over an hour before finally reviving in the fresh air. The culprit wasn't mysterious or supernatural. It was simple atmospheric chemistry, oxygen depletion. When a tomb is sealed for millennia, multiple chemical and biological processes slowly consume the oxygen within the enclosed space. Organic materials decompose, even in the dry desert environment. The process is slow, almost imperceptible, but it never completely stops. Wooden objects, linen textiles, leather, food offerings, the oils and resins used in mummification. All of these contain organic compounds that continue to break down at the molecular level, and decomposition consumes oxygen. Metals oxidize, which is simply another word for reacting with oxygen, removing it from the air. Limestone itself can react with moisture and oxygen over time. Even the paint on the walls undergoes slow chemical changes that consume oxygen molecules. Each of these reactions removes oxygen from the sealed atmosphere, replacing it with carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and various trace gases. The process is extraordinarily slow. We're talking about reactions that take centuries to produce noticeable effects. But in a perfectly sealed tomb, given 3,000 years, the cumulative effect is dramatic. The result is an atmosphere that looks normal, clear, colorless, no visible haze or smoke, but is functionally unbreathable. Modern atmospheric studies conducted in sealed tombs throughout Egypt have found oxygen levels as low as 12 to 14%, compared to the normal 21% found in open air at sea level. The effects of reduced oxygen levels on human physiology are well documented. Below 19.5% oxygen, you're in a deficient atmosphere. OSHA considers this immediately dangerous. Below 17%, cognitive function begins to decline. You make poor decisions. Your judgment is impaired. You may not even realize something is wrong. Below 15%, unconsciousness becomes likely within minutes. Below 10%, death can occur within minutes as the brain is starved of oxygen. Carter and his team had no way to measure oxygen levels. The technology simply didn't exist in any portable form in 1922. They had no oxygen meters, no atmospheric monitoring equipment, no understanding that the very act of breathing was being compromised by the air around them. They simply opened the tomb, stepped inside with their oil lamps and electric torches, and hoped for the best. And when they felt dizzy, when breathing became difficult, when workers started collapsing, they attributed it to excitement, to heat, to the psychological impact of the discovery, anything except the truth that the air itself was slowly suffocating them. The thick, oppressive sensation Carter described wasn't heat at all. It was hypoxia. His body's desperate attempt to extract oxygen from air that didn't have enough, the labored breathing, the feeling that each breath required effort, the sense that the air was somehow thick or resistant, all of these were symptoms of oxygen deprivation. His body knew something was wrong, even if his conscious mind couldn't identify the problem. The oil lamps they used for illumination actually provided an early warning system, though Carter may not have fully recognized it at the time. Fire requires oxygen. In fact, a flame is a sensitive indicator of atmospheric oxygen levels. When oxygen levels drop below about 16%, flames become noticeably dimmer and may flicker or go out entirely. Carter noted in his journals that the lamps seemed to burn less brightly inside the tomb, that they required frequent adjustment and sometimes guttered unexpectedly. He attributed this to drafts and the poor quality of the lamp oil. In reality, the lamps were warning him that the atmosphere was dangerous. Before any curse could act, before any supernatural forces could manifest, the simple lack of oxygen had already begun its work. Workers became confused, making poor decisions. One man, assigned to carefully catalog artifacts, made numerous errors in his initial notes, transposing numbers, misidentifying objects, forgetting items he had recorded just hours earlier. At the time, this was attributed to the excitement of the discovery. Looking back with modern understanding of hypoxia symptoms, it's clear he was suffering from oxygen deprivation, severe enough to impair cognitive function. Today, archaeologists use portable oxygen meters before entering any sealed space. These devices are standard safety equipment, as common as flashlights or measuring tapes. Readings are taken at multiple heights. Remember that oxygen is lighter than nitrogen, so oxygen-depleted atmospheres tend to be worse at ground level. Ventilation equipment is deployed before extensive work begins in any chamber that shows reduced oxygen levels. Workers are monitored constantly for signs of hypoxia, confusion, poor coordination, unusual behavior, complaints of breathlessness. Anyone showing symptoms is removed immediately to fresh air and monitored until they've fully recovered. But in 1922, none of this existed. The men who first entered Tutankhamun's tomb, who walked through chambers that hadn't held fresh air in 3 millennia, did so with nothing but oil lamps, courage, and the overwhelming excitement of discovery. They took shallow breaths in air that couldn't properly sustain them. They worked for hours in an atmosphere that was slowly, invisibly, shutting down their body's ability to function. They pushed through dizziness and confusion because the treasures surrounding them were too magnificent to abandon. And they survived only because the tomb wasn't completely sealed. There were small cracks and fissures that allowed some fresh air to seep in, just enough to prevent the atmosphere from becoming immediately lethal. The tomb didn't need magic to be dangerous. It didn't need curses or angry spirits or divine retribution. Physics was enough, simple atmospheric chemistry, operating according to immutable laws that care nothing for human excitement or historical significance or the glory of discovery. 3,000 years of sealed darkness. 3,000 years of slow chemical reactions consuming oxygen molecule by molecule. 3,000 years of creating an atmosphere that looked safe but could kill through nothing more than absence. The absence of the one thing human lungs need most. The treasures of Tutankhamun are displayed in museums now, protected by climate control and armed guards. Millions of people have seen the golden mask, the elaborate throne, the beautiful artifacts that filled that tomb. But few realize that the air that preserved those treasures for 3 millennia was the same air that nearly killed the men who discovered them. The tomb's first line of defense wasn't a trap. It was simply the absence of something essential, rendered invisible and deadly by time. A pungent, eye-watering burn hits the moment the entrance is breached, sharp, chemical, overwhelming. This smell announces itself with immediate physical pain, eyes streaming tears before you can think to close them, throat closing involuntarily, lungs rejecting the air before you've registered the danger. The Valley of the Kings is home to more than pharaohs and priests. It's home to Egyptian fruit bats, hundreds of thousands that have colonized abandoned tombs for centuries. They roost in darkness during the day, clinging to ceilings and walls in dense masses, and they leave behind something deadly: guano. Bat droppings accumulate in massive deposits on tomb floors, in corners, in every depression. In tombs colonized for centuries, deposits are several feet deep, layers of excrement compressed into solid mass. In enclosed chambers, this organic matter breaks down continuously, releasing ammonia gas and nitrogen oxides. Concentrations can reach levels powerful enough to cause immediate chemical burns to eyes, skin, and respiratory tissue. Ammonia in high concentrations isn't just unpleasant. It's a caustic alkaline compound that reacts violently with moisture in your eyes, nose, throat, and lungs, forming ammonium hydroxide, essentially creating a strong alkaline solution directly on your tissues. This isn't damage over time. This is immediate chemical burning on contact. In 1957, a team of Egyptian archaeologists entered a previously unexplored tomb in the Western Valley. A small chamber sealed in antiquity, but later breached by erosion that created an opening near the ceiling. The opening was perfect for bats. They had claimed the tomb sometime in the medieval period, and for perhaps 5 centuries, they roosted there undisturbed, leaving deposits over 3 feet deep. The moment the archaeologists broke through the entrance, the moment fresh air mixed with concentrated gases built up inside, all 3 men began screaming, not from fear, from immediate, excruciating pain. Their eyes streamed uncontrollably, producing tears so profuse they couldn't see. Their throats seized, closing involuntarily as their bodies tried desperately to prevent them from breathing caustic air. One vomited immediately. Another fell to his knees, clawing at his face. They retreated within seconds, not a conscious decision, but a reflexive scramble backward. But the damage was done. All 3 suffered severe chemical burns to their corneas. All 3 suffered burns to their respiratory tracts, from nostrils and sinuses down through throats into upper airways. One lost partial vision permanently, his corneas so badly scarred that even after treatment his vision remained cloudy and distorted for life. Another developed chronic bronchitis that plagued him for decades. The tomb was sealed again, not to protect its contents, but to protect anyone foolish enough to enter. A warning was posted. Local authorities were notified. But in the Egyptian desert, markers, fade and warnings are forgotten. Ammonia exposure above 300 parts per million causes immediate tissue damage. At 500 ppm, exposure for 30 minutes can be fatal. At concentrations above 2,500 ppm, measured in some bat-colonized tombs, death can occur within minutes. The gas reacts with moisture in eyes and lungs, forming ammonium hydroxide that literally burns living tissue on contact. Modern conservators describe bat-colonized tombs as hot zones, environmental hazards requiring full respiratory protection, protective eyewear, and sometimes hazmat suits with self-contained breathing apparatus. Entry protocols are strict. Atmospheric testing is required before anyone approaches. Workers wear full-face respirators with ammonia-specific filters, protective clothing covering all exposed skin, and gloves. But for most of archaeological history, such equipment didn't exist or wasn't considered necessary. Workers entered tombs with cloth wrapped around faces, crude protection that did almost nothing against concentrated ammonia. The cloth might filter dust, might provide psychological comfort, but ammonia molecules pass right through fabric, especially when concentrations saturate cloth within seconds. The bats themselves are protected now, recognized as important ecosystem components. They're pollinators, seed dispersers, and consumers of vast quantities of insects. Egyptian law prohibits disturbing bat colonies, but their presence creates an impossible dilemma: preserve wildlife or access archaeology. Where both are present, bats usually win because the alternative is risking human lives to enter chambers that may contain nothing of significant value. In tombs untouched for centuries, where bats have roosted and bred and died for generations, the living guard the dead with a weapon more effective than any ancient architect could have designed: a wall of caustic gas that announces itself with immediate, undeniable pain, a chemical barrier requiring no maintenance, no activation mechanism, no human intervention. Just time, biology, and accumulated excrement creating an atmosphere so hostile to human life that entry itself becomes an act of extreme courage or extreme foolishness. A sudden rumble, distant at first, almost imperceptible, like thunder from a storm too far to see, then growing, building. The sound transforms from distant thunder to approaching violence, to the roar of something massive moving with terrible speed. Water races through a corridor that hasn't seen moisture in decades. Water that falls from the sky just a few times per decade, but when it does, falls with accumulated fury of all those dry years. Desert rain is rare. The Valley of the Kings receives less than 1 inch of rain per year. Some years, none at all. The tombs were carved into this landscape precisely because of extreme aridity. The ancient Egyptians understood that lack of moisture would help preserve everything sealed within. But when rain comes to the desert, it comes with violence that makes the occasional nature of the threat no less deadly. The Valley of the Kings is, geologically speaking, a natural drainage basin, a bowl carved by water over millions of years, surrounded by steep limestone cliffs. When storms strike nearby mountains, rare but inevitable, rainwater doesn't soak slowly into ground as it might in temperate regions. Desert soil is too dry, too compacted, too starved of organic matter to absorb moisture quickly. Instead, water runs off, channeling through natural gullies, funneling downward through courses carved by previous floods, converging in the valley with devastating speed and force. These flash floods turn tomb entrances into waterfalls, steep descending corridors carved at angles of 30 or 40 degrees to lead to burial chambers deep in bedrock become spillways, artificial canyons that channel water with terrifying efficiency. Anyone caught inside becomes trapped between water rushing from above and the physical impossibility of climbing a steep, slippery corridor while being hit by tons of moving water carrying debris, rocks, sand, equipment becoming projectiles. On November 5, 1994, a freak rainstorm struck Luxor. Weather records showed that in less than 3 hours, the area received nearly half an inch of rain, more than half the annual average, concentrated into a single afternoon. Within hours, the Valley of the Kings was flooded. Water poured over cliff edges like waterfalls, channels carved by previous floods directing flow toward tomb entrances. Water poured into KV5, the massive tomb of the sons of Ramesses II. It flooded KV7, the tomb of Ramesses II himself. It rushed into several open tombs, carrying tons of debris. Rocks torn from cliffs, sand from the valley floor, excavation equipment. 2 workers were inside KV5 when the water hit. They were part of an American excavation team led by Kent Weeks, working deep in the tomb's labyrinthine passages, mapping chambers and documenting artifacts. They were perhaps 200 feet from the entrance, around multiple corners, deep enough that sunlight never penetrated. They were working by artificial light, focused on their task, completely unaware that the sky had opened and water was already rushing down the entrance shaft. They heard the roar first, a sound that didn't belong in the silent tomb, growing thunder that seemed to come from everywhere. Then they felt the ground tremble. Then they saw the first surge of muddy water rushing around the corner, filling the corridor, carrying sand and rocks in a churning brown flood that rose from ankle-deep to waist-deep in seconds. They ran. Uphill, against the current, fighting water that was not only flowing down but carrying debris that struck their legs, threatening to knock them off their feet. The corridor was slippery, the floor covered in mud, walls offering no handholds. The water was shockingly cold despite desert heat above, fed by runoff from higher elevations. One made it. He fought up that corridor, climbed against the flood, reached the entrance as the worst of the surge was passing. He emerged bruised, terrified, but alive. The other didn't. Perhaps he slipped. Perhaps debris struck him and knocked him down. Perhaps the current was simply too strong where he was, the corridor too steep, the water too powerful. The investigation couldn't determine exactly what happened. All they know is that he didn't emerge with his colleague. His body was found 3 days later, wedged in a side chamber, buried under 6 feet of sand and debris the flood had deposited. The water had moved so fast, with such force, that he never had a chance to find shelter, to wade out the flood in higher chambers. He had been swept along, unable to fight the current, ultimately trapped when debris settled. Flash floods in the valley aren't common, but they're not rare either. Historical records document major flooding in 1898, when Howard Carter witnessed water pouring into tombs like waterfalls. In 1916, another major flood damaged multiple tombs. In 1994, the flood that killed the KV-5 worker. In 2006, another flood caused extensive damage, though fortunately no one was inside. The danger is compounded by tomb design. Most descend at steep angles. Ancient architects carved down toward the water table, seeking to place burial chambers as deep as possible. These steep corridors create natural channels for water. When floods come, water doesn't just enter the tombs, it rushes through with acceleration, gathering speed as it descends. Chambers fill like wells, corridors become impassable rivers. Anyone inside must climb against a torrent while dodging debris, including rocks weighing hundreds of pounds. The tombs didn't need traps. The desert sky, on those rare days when it opens, does the killing. One storm, 1 hour of rain, and centuries of stillness become chaos. A translucent door stands before you, carved from a single piece of calcite so pure it seems to glow with inner light. Even by lamplight, it's breathtaking, a luminous barrier between the entrance corridor and the burial chamber beyond. You can almost see through it, shapes and shadows visible on the other side, distorted by the crystalline structure, cracks spider across its surface, hairline fractures revealing the stress the stone has endured over millennia. A lever is carefully applied, gentle at first, with all the caution professional excavators can muster, then with incrementally more force as it becomes clear the door won't move easily. Then it explodes. Calcite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate, was prized by ancient Egyptians for its beauty and translucence. When properly polished, carved from the finest specimens from the eastern desert or Sinai, it glows with ethereal quality that seem perfect for sacred contexts. The ancient Egyptians called it Egyptian alabaster. They used it for doors, offering tables, canopic jars, sacred vessels, lamps that would glow when lit from within. But calcite has a fatal flaw that becomes apparent only over millennia. It becomes brittle with time. The crystalline structure is stable under normal conditions, but susceptible to gradual degradation through multiple mechanisms. Exposure to temperature fluctuations, extreme heat of Egyptian days, followed by surprisingly cold nights, repeated thousands of times over thousands of years, causes microscopic expansion and contraction that weakens the crystal lattice. Atmospheric changes, particularly shifts in humidity during the rare times when tombs are opened and closed, cause stress at the molecular level. Simple aging degrades the bonds between crystal planes. Stress fractures develop invisibly within the stone, propagating slowly through the material like cracks spreading through ice, creating planes of weakness that aren't visible from outside until it's too late. And when pressure is applied to calcite that has spent 3,000 years developing these internal fractures, even gentle pressure, even carefully controlled force, the entire piece can shatter into razor-sharp fragments that explode outward with enough velocity to cause serious injury. In 1911, Italian archaeologist Ernesto Schiaparelli was excavating the tomb of Nefertari, QV66 in the Valley of the Queens. At the entrance to the burial chamber stood an obstacle, a calcite door, still intact after 3,000 years, translucent, beautiful, and completely blocking access to the chamber beyond. Schiaparelli recognized its value. His team approached the task with all the care and expertise they possessed. They inserted wooden wedges around the edges, trying to work the door free without applying direct pressure to the calcite itself. They applied gentle leverage, testing the door's resistance. They worked slowly, methodically, taking hours for a task that might have been accomplished in minutes if they'd been willing to simply smash through. The door shattered with the sound of breaking glass. A sharp, crystalline crack followed immediately by the crash of fragments hitting stone. But unlike glass, which shatters into relatively blunt pieces, calcite fractures along crystal planes, creating edges that are molecularly sharp, fragments that can cut like surgical blades. One worker was struck in the face, suffering deep lacerations across his cheek and forehead that left permanent scars. Another caught a shard in his forearm that severed the radial artery. Blood sprayed across the ancient paintings. His colleagues applied pressure, used strips torn from their clothing as improvised bandages, and managed to slow the bleeding enough to get him to medical help. They saved his life, but barely. He required over 40 stitches and lost partial use of his hand. The severed artery was repaired, but nerve damage left him with permanent weakness and numbness in 3 fingers. For a man whose livelihood depended on manual labor, this was devastating. The door itself was destroyed, irreplaceable, priceless, a 3,000-year-old work of art reduced to fragments in seconds. Some pieces were large enough to save and are now displayed in museums, but most of the door was reduced to slivers and powder. Similar incidents have occurred throughout Luxor's tombs over more than a century of excavation. Modern conservation protocols now treat calcite with extreme caution. Objects are stabilized with modern resins before any attempt to move them. Structural integrity is assessed using non-invasive imaging techniques. Workers wear full protective gear when handling calcite objects. But in the early days, beautiful objects were assumed to be stable because they looked stable, because they had survived for 3,000 years. The door in Nefertari's tomb wasn't meant to be opened by modern hands. After 3,000 years of standing as a barrier between worlds, it fought back the only way it could, with the simple physics of brittle materials under stress, transforming beauty into weapons. Restoration workers chip away at ancient plaster, working carefully with small tools, exposing painted surfaces beneath layer by layer. White powder rises like smoke in the beam of their headlamps, catching the light, drifting through still air of the tomb like snow suspended in amber. The powder catches in their throats, makes them cough, settles on their skin and clothes and equipment. They breathe it in, then begin to cough, then continue working because coughing is expected in tomb work, because discomfort is just part of the job. Egyptian tombs were sealed with lime plaster, a mixture of limestone burned to create quicklime, then mixed with sand and water to create a paste that hardens into a durable protective layer. The ancient Egyptians understood chemistry in practical ways modern scientists are still studying. They knew lime plaster would seal a tomb effectively, protect painted surfaces, create a barrier between the sacred space of the burial and the outside world. Over millennia, lime plaster degrades. The chemical bonds that hold it together weaken. It becomes friable, crumbling easily. It turns into dust, fine, highly alkaline dust, that becomes airborne at the slightest disturbance. When disturbed during restoration or excavation, this dust becomes a weapon. When inhaled, it causes severe chemical burns to the respiratory tract, burns that are immediate, painful, and in many cases permanent. Calcium hydroxide, the primary component of lime plaster, has a pH around 12.5, making it strongly alkaline. For reference, household bleach typically has a pH around 12. Drain cleaner has a pH around 14. Lime plaster dust falls right in that range of extreme alkalinity. Contact with moist tissue, like the inside of your lungs, your throat, your nasal passages, causes immediate chemical burning. The alkaline dust reacts with moisture in your airways, forming a caustic solution that literally burns tissue on contact, creating inflammation and scarring that can be permanent. In the 1960s, a UNESCO team was conducting restoration work inside the tomb of Seti the Rapsi, KV-17 in the Valley of the Kings. The walls were covered in deteriorating plaster that needed careful removal to preserve the painted reliefs beneath. The work couldn't be rushed. Each area had to be documented before any plaster was removed. Workers spent hours, days, weeks chipping carefully at ancient plaster, breathing clouds of alkaline dust with every careful stroke of their tools. The work was conducted in cramped spaces where air circulation was poor, where the dust they raised hung in the air for hours. They wore simple cloth masks, the best protection available at the time, but utterly inadequate against the chemical hazard they faced. Cloth masks might filter out large particles, but microscopic particles of lime plaster pass right through. Within weeks, several conservators developed symptoms that couldn't be ignored. Chronic coughing that wouldn't stop, that kept them. Awake at night, that grew worse instead of better. Difficulty breathing, a feeling of tightness in the chest that made every breath feel like work. Persistent throat pain that wasn't helped by any treatment. One conservator wrote in his journal, "My throat felt flayed. Each breath was fire. I coughed until I tasted blood." Medical examinations revealed severe alkaline burns throughout their respiratory systems. The delicate tissues lining their throats, airways, and lungs had been chemically burned by repeated exposure to lime dust. Some developed chronic bronchitis, permanent inflammation of the airways that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Others suffered permanent scarring of lung tissue that reduces lung capacity and makes every breath slightly harder than it should be. The work was halted for months while safety protocols were developed. When it resumed, workers wore modern respirators with proper filters. They wore protective clothing that was removed and laundered after each shift. Water misting systems were installed to keep dust levels down. Work shifts were shortened. Medical monitoring became mandatory. But for the first generation of conservators who worked in tombs across Egypt throughout the early and mid-20th century, lime dust was simply part of the job. Annoying, uncomfortable, but seemingly harmless. They coughed, they complained about the dust, and they continued working. A 2003 medical study examined the health records of retired tomb conservators who had worked in Egypt between 1950 and 1990. The results were damning. Elevated rates of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease at 340% above the general population. Asthma at rates 280% higher than expected. Pulmonary fibrosis, scarring of lung tissue, at rates 450% above normal. Many of these workers died young. The average life expectancy for tomb conservators in the study was 68 years, compared to 76 years for the general population. Most suffered chronic respiratory issues for decades before they died. The irony is bitter. Workers dedicated to preserving Egypt's ancient heritage were slowly poisoned by the very materials the ancients used to protect their tombs. The plaster meant to seal and preserve became, over millennia, a weapon against anyone who tried to undo that seal. Resin-stained stone floors stretched before you in the lamplight, dark with substances that seeped into porous limestone thousands of years ago and never quite left. Clay jars filled with ancient substances line the walls, some still sealed, others broken open. The air smells sharp, wrong, like turpentine mixed with decay, like organic solvents and something sweetish that catches in the back of your throat. This isn't a tomb. This is a workshop, and it's more dangerous than any burial chamber could ever be. In 2018, archaeologists uncovered an intact mummification workshop at Saqqara, the first of its kind ever found with its tools, chemicals, and organic materials still in place. The workshop dated to the 26th dynasty, around 600 BCE, when mummification techniques had been refined over thousands of years into a sophisticated science. It was also, as the excavation team discovered within hours, a chemical hazard zone, unlike anything they had encountered before. The workshop contained jars of natron, sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, the primary desiccating agent used in mummification. It contained containers of resin imported from Lebanon, beeswax, oils extracted from plants and animals, and numerous unidentified organic compounds. Some jars had been sealed for over 2,600 years. When the chamber was opened, when fresh air mixed with the sealed atmosphere that had remained stable for millennia, these substances reacted. Volatile organic compounds off-gassed immediately as fresh oxygen reached materials that hadn't been exposed to air in thousands of years. Resin vapors, thick and heavy, rose from containers and from resin-stained floors. Natron dust, disturbed by movement of air and people, became airborne. Within hours, multiple team members developed alarming symptoms: stinging eyes that produced tears uncontrollably, dizziness severe enough that several workers had to sit down, nausea that came in waves, severe headaches that felt, as one archaeologist described it, like someone driving a nail through my skull from the inside. One archaeologist collapsed entirely and required medical evacuation. He was found unconscious near one of the resin containers. Chemical analysis conducted afterward revealed dangerous concentrations of multiple compounds: formaldehyde, a known carcinogen, at levels 15 times higher than OSHA considers safe for occupational exposure; benzene, another carcinogen, at concentrations that would require immediate evacuation in any modern workplace; various aromatic hydrocarbons at levels that cause immediate symptoms and long-term health risks. The natron dust posed its own serious threat. Natron is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs moisture from whatever it contacts. In mummification, this property made it perfect for desiccating corpses. In human respiratory tracts, this property makes it dangerous. Inhaling natron dust causes severe drying of mucous membranes. Initial symptoms include nosebleeds as dry, nasal passages crack and bleed, cracked bleeding lips, severe throat irritation, and respiratory irritation that causes coughing and difficulty breathing. Prolonged exposure can cause permanent damage to lung tissue. Workers who spent extended periods in the mummification workshop without adequate protection developed chronic respiratory problems that persisted long after the excavation ended. The resins posed an even greater threat. Ancient Egyptians imported pine resin from Lebanon at enormous expense. They also used frankincense and myrrh from Arabia and the Horn of Africa. These organic compounds were applied liberally to mummies and stored in workshops in large quantities. Over millennia, chemical breakdown produces toxic vapors. The complex organic molecules in resin break down into simpler compounds, including formaldehyde, acetone, and various aromatic hydrocarbons. In a sealed chamber, these compounds accumulate, reaching concentrations far above anything considered safe. Modern industrial hygiene standards classify environments with these chemical concentrations as requiring full respiratory protection, continuous environmental monitoring, and strict exposure time limits. But the 2018 team had no warning. They expected dust and stale air, the normal hazards of tomb excavation. What they found was a chemical time bomb, a sealed chamber full of compounds that had been brewing, concentrating, becoming more dangerous with every passing century. The excavation was suspended for 3 months while environmental assessments were conducted and safety protocols were established. Industrial hygienists measured air quality. Chemists analyzed samples to identify compounds and concentrations. Engineers designed ventilation systems. When work resumed, it was under strict controls: respirators with organic vapor filters, air sampling equipment that continuously monitored exposure levels, limited exposure times with mandatory breaks, protective clothing that was carefully decontaminated after each shift. The ancient art of preserving the dead corrodes the living, not through curses or supernatural forces, but through chemistry, patient, invisible, and still potent after 26 centuries. 3 shafts drop into darkness, their openings barely visible in the sand-scoured surface of the Giza Plateau. No ropes existed in antiquity to help the ancient workers who carved these spaces. No warning signs exist today either, just voids in the stone, yawning and patient, waiting with infinite geological patience. The Old Kingdom elite designed their tombs with deliberate complexity that went far beyond simple burial chambers. Multiple burial shafts, sometimes 3 or 4 from a single offering chapel, interconnected chambers that formed underground networks, false passages that led nowhere, dead ends carved with the same precision as functional spaces, designed to confuse and misdirect, decoy chambers that looked important but contained nothing, while the real burial was hidden elsewhere in the complex. This wasn't just architectural sophistication for its own sake. This was psychological warfare against tomb robbers, warfare that would have to operate across centuries without any human intervention. The tombs themselves had to be their own defense, their layout so confusing that even someone who managed to break in would struggle to find anything of value before getting lost or falling into one of the shafts they didn't know existed. And it still works. 4,000 years later, these architectural defenses still claim victims. In 1935, American archaeologist George Reisner was excavating the Eastern Cemetery at Giza. One of his Egyptian foremen, Hassan Abd el-Rasul, had worked with Reisner for over a decade. He knew the site as well as anyone alive. He had helped map dozens of tombs, had descended into countless shafts, had navigated the underground mazes more times than he could count. He was experienced, careful, trusted with significant responsibility. On a day that started like any other, he stepped onto what he believed was solid ground between two shafts that had already been mapped and documented. It wasn't solid ground. It was a third shaft, unmapped and unexpected, concealed beneath a thin stone cover that had eroded over 4 millennia to near transparency. The cover had held for 4,000 years, supporting nothing heavier than windblown sand. But Hassan's weight was enough to break through. He fell 43 feet into darkness. His scream echoed through the cemetery. Workers rushed to the edge, lowering lanterns on ropes, calling his name into the darkness. He responded, his voice weak, distorted by pain. But he was conscious. He was alive. The rescue took 6 hours. They had to improvise everything. Lower ropes, trying to get them close enough that Hassan could reach them despite his injuries. Construct a makeshift pulley system from excavation equipment never designed for this purpose. Work carefully because any mistake could hit Hassan and cause more damage. After hours of work, hours during which Hassan drifted in and out of consciousness, they managed to haul him to the surface. Both his legs were shattered, compound fractures where broken bone had pierced through skin. His spine was fractured in 2 places, internal injuries that would take weeks to fully understand. He survived, but his life as he knew it was over. He would never walk normally again. The best medical treatment available in 1935 Egypt couldn't fully repair the damage. He spent months in hospital, underwent multiple surgeries, and emerged permanently disabled. The shaft he'd fallen into wasn't even a burial chamber. It was empty, an architectural decoy, a void designed to confuse robbers about the tomb's true layout. It had no purpose except to be there, to be a trap for the unwary. It had worked perfectly. For 4,000 years, it had waited. And when someone finally stepped in the wrong place, it performed exactly as the ancient architects had intended. Reisner documented at least 3 more serious falls during his decades at Giza. An Egyptian engineer broke both legs and an arm in 1926 when he fell into a shaft that opened unexpectedly beneath scaffolding. A British assistant fell into a shaft in 1932 while conducting a survey, suffering a fractured skull and permanent hearing loss. Another worker disappeared into an unmapped shaft in 1939. By the time they found it the next morning and mounted a rescue, he had been at the bottom for over 12 hours. When they finally brought him up 3 days later, he had been dead for over 48 hours. The tombs at Giza are riddled with these triple shaft configurations and more complex variations. Some are marked on maps now, documented and protected with barriers. Others remain hidden beneath sand, beneath debris, beneath thin layers of deteriorating stone that look solid until they're not. Modern excavations use ground-penetrating radar to map underground structures before anyone sets foot on uncertain ground. Workers are tethered with safety ropes when working near known shaft locations. But in the early 20th century, such precautions were rare. Excavators walked where experience suggested safety. Sometimes experience was enough. Sometimes experience was wrong. Sometimes the tomb had one more trick. A shaft positioned where no shaft should be. A weak floor where stone should be solid. A trap that had waited 4,000 years for someone to step in exactly the wrong place. A worker descends into a deep shaft, rope wrapped around his waist in careful coils, lantern swinging from a hook on his belt as he climbs down, using footholds carved into the shaft wall 4,000 years ago. 20 feet down, the flame begins to flicker, the light wavering in ways that have nothing to do with his movement. 30 feet, the flame dims noticeably, burning lower and weaker, the circle of light it casts growing smaller. He calls up to his colleagues above, mentions that the lamp seems to be running low on oil, though he filled it just an hour ago. At 40 feet, the flame goes out entirely, just dies, as if someone had blown it out. Complete darkness now, except for the circle of daylight far above that seems impossibly distant. He's still descending because his instructions were clear. Reach the bottom, assess the depth, report what he finds. Still breathing because his lungs are working, drawing air in and out in the rhythms that have sustained him for his entire life. But something is wrong. His head feels strange, light somehow, disconnected. His thoughts are becoming fuzzy around the edges, harder to hold on to. His hands, gripping the rope, feel like they belong to someone else. The air here is dead. And he has perhaps seconds to realize it before consciousness abandons him entirely. Middle Kingdom tombs, particularly those built during the 12th dynasty around 1900 BCE, often incorporated deep well shafts into their designs, vertical passages that dropped 50, 60, sometimes 80 feet or more below ground level. These shafts served multiple purposes in the architecture of the tomb. They deterred robbers. No casual thief was going to descend 80 feet into darkness on the chance of finding treasure. They protected burial chambers from the flash floods that occasionally swept through the wadis and valleys where tombs were built. Water might flow into the upper chambers, but it would drain down these shafts and away from the most important spaces. They created structural stability, allowing architects to carve larger chambers at lower levels without worrying about the weight of stone above. But they also created death traps, confined spaces where atmospheric conditions could become lethal without any visible warning. At depths below 40 feet, especially in shafts with limited air circulation, oxygen levels drop dangerously low through multiple mechanisms. Heavier gases, carbon dioxide produced by organic decomposition, nitrogen that has slowly displaced oxygen through various chemical processes, settle at the bottom of shafts like invisible pools. The oxygen, being lighter, rises toward the opening, leaving the lowest areas depleted. In shafts that have been sealed for centuries or millennia, the oxygen at the bottom can be consumed entirely by oxidation reactions with the rock, by the slow decomposition of any organic material that fell or was placed in the shaft, by chemical processes that operate so. Slowly they're imperceptible on human timescales, but over centuries accomplish dramatic transformations. The lantern goes out first because fire requires oxygen. Flames are extremely sensitive to atmospheric oxygen levels and will die when levels drop below, about 16%, well before humans lose consciousness. When the flame dies, it's a warning that any person working in confined spaces should recognize immediately. But by then, for someone already deep in the shaft, it's often too late. The time it takes to recognize the danger, to make the decision to retreat, to begin climbing back toward fresh air, all of that time is spent in an oxygen-depleted atmosphere, and with every breath, the body and brain are being starved of what they need most. The danger is completely invisible. There's no smell. Oxygen deprivation doesn't have an odor. There's no color or haze or visible warning. No obvious indication that the air has become dangerous. Just a gradual oxygen depletion that causes hypoxia. Confusion first, as the brain struggles to function without adequate oxygen. Poor judgment, inability to recognize that something is wrong. Then motor impairment, loss of coordination. Then unconsciousness. Then, if exposure continues, death as the brain and heart are deprived of oxygen for too long. The shafts are still there, carved deep into bedrock, descending into darkness. And, at the bottom of each shaft, the atmosphere waits in whatever state time and chemistry have created. Perhaps safe, perhaps not. Impossible to know without testing. The further you descend, the less the tomb wants you there. Not through malice, not through intention, but through simple physics and chemistry. Through the fact that deep places don't breathe, that air doesn't circulate in vertical shafts, that gas is separate by weight and oxygen rises while heavier gases sink. Salt crystals sparkle like stars on the chamber walls, catching lamplight and reflecting it in 1,000 tiny points of brilliance. Beautiful beyond description. Delicate formations that look like frost, like ice crystals on a winter window, geometric perfection, formed over millennia through the slow work of chemistry and time. White and gold patterns coat the painted surfaces, outlining hieroglyphs, accentuating carved reliefs, adding an ethereal quality to artwork that was already magnificent. Then someone brushes against them, inadvertently, just a sleeve catching the wall as they turn in the narrow corridor. The crystals shatter into microscopic shards, each one sharp enough to cut skin and eyes like glass splinters. Amarna, Tel El Amarna, the short-lived capital built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten during his radical religious revolution in the 14th century BCE, sits in a unique geological zone along the Nile in Middle Egypt. The limestone at Amarna is rich in soluble salts, sodium chloride, sodium sulfate, calcium sulfate. Over time, through a process called efflorescence, these salts leach to the surface. Groundwater dissolves salts from within the stone and carries them toward the surface through capillary action. When the water evaporates, the salts are left behind, crystallizing on the surface in formations that grow slowly over millennia. The result is stunning, crystalline formations that coat tomb walls in glittering patterns that look like intentional decoration. They're also incredibly dangerous in ways that aren't apparent until they're disturbed. When these salt blooms are touched or brushed or disturbed by any physical contact, they fracture into fragments so small they're nearly invisible to the naked eye, but sharp enough to cause severe lacerations. The crystal structure of these salts, when they form slowly through efflorescence, creates geometric patterns that include incredibly sharp edges. When the formations break, they break along crystal planes, creating fragments with edges measured in nanometers, sharp at the molecular level, capable of slicing through human tissue like microscopic surgical blades. The dust becomes airborne with the slightest disturbance. It settles on skin, creating what feels at first like a tingling sensation, then escalating to burning as thousands of microscopic cuts allow the salt to penetrate tissue. It gets in eyes, where salt crystals on the delicate surface of the cornea cause immediate, excruciating pain. It's inhaled, where the fragments lodge in airways and lungs. In 1981, a German archaeological team was documenting tomb paintings at Amarna. A conservator, focused on positioning her camera, accidentally brushed against a wall covered in salt efflorescence. The crystals disintegrated into a cloud of glittering dust that hung in the air like a fog. Within seconds, she was screaming. Not a brief cry of surprise, but sustained screaming. Her eyes burned, not metaphorically, but truly burned as if acid had been splashed in them. Tears streamed down her face so profusely she couldn't see. Her exposed skin felt like it was on fire. Red welts appeared across her arms and face. The burning intensified rather than fading, the salt dissolving in the moisture on her skin and creating an alkaline solution that continued causing damage. The team rushed her to a field hospital in El Minya, a drive of over an hour. Medical staff spent hours irrigating her eyes with a sterile saline, washing away salt crystals that had embedded themselves in her corneas. They treated her skin, removing microscopic salt shards that required magnification to even see. She recovered, but not completely. The damage to her corneas left permanent scarring. Her vision remained affected, cloudy, distorted, with light scattering effects that made detailed work difficult. Her career as a photographer and documentarian was effectively ended. Recurring eye irritation plagued her for years. Modern conservators treat salt blooms with extreme caution. They're stabilized with chemical solutions before any physical contact. Workers wear full protective clothing, long sleeves, gloves, face shields, respirators. But in the early days of Amarna's excavation, these formations were seen as beautiful curiosities. They were photographed, documented, touched, sometimes even collected. Workers had no understanding that these beautiful crystals were weapons waiting to be activated. Beauty becomes a blade at the molecular level. Cedar coffins flake softly under touch, the wood's surface releasing fragments that drift down like dark snow. The texture is strange, simultaneously dry and somehow soft, crumbling in ways that solid wood shouldn't crumble. A faint, musty smell rises from the ancient timber, Organic and almost pleasant at first, like old books in a damp library, like the smell of forest floors in autumn when leaves decompose. It's a smell that speaks of age, of organic processes, of nature reclaiming what was once living wood. But this isn't simple decay, this is colonization, and what has colonized this wood is far more dangerous than the slow rot of time. Tomb KV35, discovered in 1898 by French archaeologist Victor Loret, contained several royal mummies in a discovery that rivaled anything found in the Valley of the Kings. Inside the dark chambers, Loret found Amenhotep II still resting in his original cedar coffin, a rare instance of a royal burial remaining more or less in place despite 3 millennia of disturbances. Cedar was precious in ancient Egypt beyond measure. Egypt had no native cedar forests. The trees grew in the mountains of Lebanon, and obtaining cedar required extensive trade networks and enormous expense. The wood was prized not just for its beauty and durability, but for its aromatic oils, which ancient Egyptians believed helped preserve the dead and repel the insects and decay that threatened even mummified remains. They were partially right about cedar's preservative properties. Cedar does contain natural antimicrobial compounds that inhibit bacterial and fungal growth. For centuries, even millennia, these compounds do their work, but over 3,000 years, even cedar succumbs. And what colonizes the wood, once those defenses fail, is far more dangerous than simple rot. Toxic molds. Specifically, species from the Stachybough trees and Aspergillus families, known colloquially and ominously as black mold and toxic mold. These aren't just nuisance fungi that cause allergic reactions. These are organisms that produce mycotoxins, organic compounds that can cause neurological symptoms, immune system suppression, chronic respiratory disease, and in cases of severe exposure, death. When Loret's team opened Amenhotep II's coffin in 1898, several workers reported feeling unwell almost immediately. The symptoms were strange, not easily attributable to any known cause. Headaches that came on suddenly and intensified quickly. Dizziness that made it difficult to stand. Strange visual disturbances. One worker reported seeing shadows moving at the edges of his vision, shapes that disappeared when he looked directly at them. One worker developed tremors that persisted for weeks after the coffin was opened, a fine shaking in his hands that made delicate work impossible. Another complained of memory problems and difficulty concentrating. He would start a task and then forget what he was doing, would lose track of conversations mid-sentence. A third suffered severe respiratory distress that required him to leave the excavation entirely and return to Cairo for treatment. At the time, these symptoms were dismissed as heat exhaustion, as psychological effects of working in confined spaces surrounded by death. But modern toxicological analysis suggests something far more sinister. Mycotoxin poisoning from exposure to toxic molds that had colonized the ancient cedar. Stachybotrys chartarum produces trichothecene mycotoxins, complex organic molecules that inhibit protein synthesis at the cellular level. These aren't simple irritants. They're compounds that interfere with fundamental cellular processes. Exposure causes a cascade of symptoms. Cognitive impairment as brain cells struggle to function, memory loss, tremors, immune dysfunction. Chronic exposure can be fatal, as cumulative damage exceeds the body's ability to repair itself. Aspergillus species produce aflatoxins, recognized as among the most potent carcinogens found in nature. They damage liver and kidney function, suppress immune function, and cause acute symptoms, including nausea and abdominal pain. Long-term exposure significantly increases cancer risk and contributes to chronic organ damage that may not manifest for years or decades. Both types of mold thrive in the organic-rich environment of wooden coffins. Wood is an ideal substrate for fungal growth. It's organic, porous, contains nutrients that fungi can extract. In tombs where humidity fluctuates or groundwater penetrates through cracks, conditions become perfect for mold growth. And once established, these molds can persist for centuries, producing mycotoxins continuously, waiting for the moment when the coffin is opened and their spores can become airborne. Modern conservators now wear full respirators with HEPA filters when handling ancient wood. Coffins arriving from excavations are immediately isolated and tested for fungal contamination. Wood samples are analyzed to identify exactly what species are present. Workers handling contaminated materials are monitored medically, with regular checkups looking for signs of mycotoxin exposure. But for a century of archaeologists and museum workers, handling ancient cedar was routine, unremarkable, just part of the job. The wood was touched, moved, sampled, cleaned, all with no understanding of the invisible poison it carried. Coffins were opened in tomb chambers with poor ventilation, spores becoming airborne, and remaining suspended in still air for hours. The wood meant to cradle pharaohs becomes poison to those who open those cradles 3 millennia later. Soft to the touch, fragrant with the ghost of cedar's aromatic oils, beautiful in its age and craftsmanship, and deadly, colonized by organisms that produce some of nature's most potent toxins. Organisms that have had thousands of years to establish themselves in ideal conditions. A trap not built by human hands, but cultivated by time and biology in the perfect darkness of sealed tombs. A sudden wave of warmth hits you as you descend deeper into the pyramid's interior passages. The air feels thick. Not hot exactly. Not the searing heat of the Egyptian sun that bakes the desert surface above. This is different. Dense. Heavy. Like trying to breathe through cotton, or like the air itself has somehow become more substantial, offering resistance to entering your lungs. Breathing becomes labor, each breath requiring conscious effort where it should be automatic, unconscious, effortless. Then consciousness begins to slip away. Not suddenly, not with any dramatic moment of realization, but gradually, like falling asleep when you're trying to stay awake. Thoughts become fuzzy, disconnected. Your body feels heavy, exhausted. Even though you've only been working for an hour, the natural response is to sit down, to rest, to catch your breath in this strange, thick air. And sitting down in this place, at this depth, is the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. The Pyramid of Meidum, attributed to the pharaoh Sneferu, who reigned around 2600 BCE, is one of Egypt's architectural oddities, a pyramid that appears to have partially collapsed in antiquity, leaving a tower-like core surrounded by a debris field of limestone blocks. But the pyramid's unusual structure is the least of its dangers. The real threat isn't the unstable architecture visible from outside. It's what is accumulated inside, invisible and odorless, waiting in the deep chambers and descending passages. Carbon dioxide pockets, CO2, a molecule so common, so ubiquitous in Earth's atmosphere that it seems harmless. And at normal concentrations, around 0.04% of air, it is harmless. But in the confined spaces of ancient pyramids, CO2 can accumulate to concentrations that kill. CO2 is heavier than air, about 50% heavier than nitrogen and oxygen. This seemingly simple fact has profound implications in enclosed spaces with poor circulation. The carbon dioxide sinks, settling in low-lying areas like water filling a pool. It displaces oxygen silently, invisibly, creating pockets of gas that look perfectly normal, that have no smell or color or visible warning, but that are functionally unbreathable. Unlike hydrogen sulfide, which announces itself with a rotten egg smell, carbon dioxide is completely odorless. You don't smell it. You don't see any haze or discoloration in the air. You just stop breathing properly, stop getting adequate oxygen, and your body begins shutting down. But in ways that are insidious rather than obvious, that impair judgment and cognitive function before you lose consciousness, that make you unable to recognize the danger you're in. In 1910, Italian archaeologist Alessandro Barsanti was surveying the interior chambers of Meidum, documenting the pyramid's architecture. Barsanti was experienced, careful, methodical in his work, qualities that had served him well in years of excavating throughout Egypt. He had worked in dozens of tombs and pyramids without incident. He had no reason to expect this pyramid to be any different. He was in one of the lower chambers, perhaps 50 feet below the pyramid's entrance level, working by lamplight. Then he experienced what he later described as sudden overwhelming fatigue, a feeling of exhaustion so profound it was impossible to resist. His legs felt like they weighed hundreds of pounds. The simple act of standing upright seemed to require more energy than he possessed. He sat down to rest, intending just to catch his breath. Sitting felt wonderful, a relief from the strange exhaustion. His vision began to blur at the edges. His breathing became shallow, without him consciously noticing. The notebook he'd been writing in slipped from his fingers, and he barely noticed it fall. His assistant, working in an upper chamber, noticed that Barsanti had gone silent. Concerned, the assistant descended and found Barsanti sitting against a wall, his head drooping, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin pale and waxy. The assistant recognized immediately that something was seriously wrong. He grabbed Barsanti under the arms and dragged him toward the entrance passage, hauling the unconscious archaeologist up toward fresh air and sunlight. By the time they reached the pyramid entrance, Barsanti was barely conscious. His breathing was dangerously shallow. His pulse was weak and irregular. The assistant laid him in the shade and fanned him with a notebook, trying to get fresh air into his lungs. Barsanti recovered, but slowly. He lay in the shade for over an hour, gradually becoming more alert, his breathing slowly returning to normal. When he could finally speak coherently, he had no clear memory of what had happened, just the overwhelming fatigue, the decision to sit and rest, and then nothing until he woke outside the pyramid. He never entered that chamber again. In his private journal, he wrote, "Something in that chamber nearly killed me. The air itself was wrong, though I could not see or smell any difference. I sat down to rest and felt consciousness leaving me, felt myself dying without pain or fear, just a gradual fading into nothing. Had my assistant not found me when he did, I would not have emerged from that pyramid alive." Modern excavators use atmospheric monitoring equipment constantly when working in pyramids and tombs. Handheld CO2 detectors are standard equipment. If levels exceed 1%, work stops immediately. Ventilation equipment is brought in. Fans that blow fresh air into chambers, extractors that pull stale air out. But for early archaeologists like Barsanti, there was no equipment, no monitoring, no warning. Just the gradual feeling of exhaustion, the treacherous temptation to sit down and rest in the very place that was killing them. The body's responses to CO2 poisoning include fatigue and the overwhelming desire to rest. Responses that become deadly in sealed chambers, where resting means staying in the toxic atmosphere longer, breathing more of it, accelerating the progression toward unconsciousness and death. The tomb doesn't choke you with visible gas or obvious poison. It kills by creating the illusion that rest will help, that sitting down will restore your strength. And in those sealed ancient spaces, that illusion is fatal. The air seems thick, dense, unnatural, like trying to breathe through layers of fabric, like the atmosphere has somehow become more viscous, offering resistance where there should be none. You take deep breaths, full, desperate breaths, chest expanding, lungs working, but nothing helps. The oxygen starvation feeling doesn't improve. If anything, it gets worse. The dizziness intensifies, confusion sets in, thoughts becoming scattered and hard to hold together. And you never realize what's happening until it's too late, until you've taken that last step, drawn that last breath, and consciousness simply ends like a light switching off. Nitrogen asphyxiation is one of the most insidious dangers in ancient Egyptian tombs, insidious specifically because nitrogen itself isn't toxic. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe. It's inert. Our bodies don't use it, don't process it, don't react to it. In normal atmospheric concentrations, it's completely harmless. But when nitrogen concentrations rise above normal and oxygen levels fall correspondingly, the body suffocates without any sensation of suffocation. The human respiratory drive, the unconscious urge to breathe, isn't triggered by lack of oxygen. It's triggered by buildup of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. In an atmosphere rich in nitrogen but depleted of oxygen, you exhale CO2 normally. There's no buildup. Your body's respiratory control system reads everything as fine. You keep breathing at a normal rate, feeling no distress, no air hunger, no warning that anything is wrong. Meanwhile, your blood oxygen levels are plummeting, your brain and organs are being starved, and the progression to unconsciousness is rapid. You might feel slightly dizzy, you might notice your thinking becoming fuzzy, but there's no panic, no desperate gasping for air, no obvious warning that you're dying. You just stop. Consciousness ends. At Saqqara, particularly in the deeper tombs of the Third Dynasty dating to around 2650 BCE, nitrogen accumulation is common due to the exceptional precision with which these tombs were sealed. Stone doors fitted so precisely that gaps measured in millimeters, plaster seals that created virtually hermetic chambers. In chambers sealed with virtually no air exchange for thousands of years, biological and chemical processes slowly consumed oxygen. Organic materials decomposed, metals oxidized. Limestone reacted with moisture and oxygen. Each process removed oxygen molecules from the sealed atmosphere. What's left behind is an atmosphere increasingly rich in nitrogen, increasingly depleted of oxygen. The nitrogen doesn't increase, rather, the oxygen decreases, and nitrogen's percentage rises correspondingly. The result is an atmosphere that looks normal, that has no smell or visible characteristics to warn of danger, but that lacks the oxygen necessary to sustain human life. In 1952, during excavations at Saqqara, an Egyptian worker descended into a recently opened chamber to begin clearing debris. The chamber had been sealed since antiquity, its door intact until the excavation team broke through just hours earlier. The worker descended with a rope and lantern, calling up observations to colleagues above. He appeared fine. His voice was steady, his reports coherent. He described painted decorations, noted several ceramic vessels, estimated the debris requiring clearance. Then he simply sat down. No warning, no cry of distress. He just stopped mid-sentence and sat down against the chamber wall. His colleague, watching from above, called down repeatedly. No response. The sitting worker remained motionless, head drooping forward slightly, the lamp beside him still burning steadily. The colleague descended to check on him. When he reached him, he found the man unconscious, still sitting upright. His breathing was shallow, his pulse was weak. The colleague tried to wake him, but couldn't. Growing dizzy himself, he abandoned his rescue attempt and scrambled for the entrance. By the time they organized a rescue, the unconscious worker was dead. He had been at the bottom perhaps 30 minutes. The autopsy revealed no trauma, no obvious cause of death. The official report listed sudden cardiac event, but the excavation team knew better. Something about the air in that chamber was deadly. Only decades later did anyone realize what had happened. Nitrogen asphyxiation in a chamber sealed so well that oxygen depletion over millennia had created an atmosphere that looked normal but was utterly deadly. Breathe all you want. Fill your lungs completely. It won't help, because the air you're breathing contains everything except the one thing that actually matters: oxygen. A stone shifts under your hand as you reach into a dark crevice searching for artifacts. Something skitters across ancient plaster. Fast, segmented, moving with the distinctive scuttling motion of an arthropod disturbed from its hiding place. Your hand jerks back instinctively, but not quite fast enough. You feel a sharp burning pain on your finger, like being stabbed with a hot needle, and in the lamplight, you catch a glimpse of something pale and segmented disappearing into the shadows, tail curved over its back in the unmistakable profile of a scorpion. Then the real pain begins. Egyptian deathstalker scorpions, Lyrus quinquestriatus, are among the most venomous scorpions in the world. They're also perfectly adapted to the environment of ancient tombs: dark, dry, stable temperature year-round, protection from the extreme heat of the desert surface, and countless hiding places in cracks and crevices. Tombs aren't monuments to the dead for these creatures. They're perfect habitats, offering everything a scorpion needs to survive and thrive. For humans entering those tombs, with hands reaching into unseen spaces, with feet stepping over debris in dim light, with bodies crawling through narrow passages, scorpions become landmines. Living, mobile, defensive landmines armed with venom, perfected by millions of years of evolution. In 1923, during the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, Howard Carter documented several scorpion encounters that rarely make it into popular accounts. One worker was stung while moving debris, the scorpion hidden beneath limestone. Another found a scorpion in his shoe. A third was stung on the ankle while crawling through a narrow passage. The scorpion pressed between his leg and the stone wall, stinging in self-defense as it was crushed. All three survived, but the experiences were described in terms that convey pain beyond anything most had experienced before. One worker wrote that the pain felt like molten metal poured into the veins, like fire spreading from the sting site throughout the entire limb and beyond. Another described waves of pain that peaked and ebbed, but never fully subsided, pain that made sleep impossible for 3 days. Deathstalker venom is a complex cocktail of neurotoxins, proteins and peptides specifically evolved to target nervous systems. The primary components bind to sodium and potassium channels in nerve cells, disrupting the electrical signals that make nervous systems function. The pain is immediate and extreme, but pain is just the beginning. The venom spreads through the lymphatic system and bloodstream, affecting nerve function throughout the body. Muscle spasms begin, involuntary contractions violent enough to cause muscle strains. Respiratory difficulty develops as the toxins affect the nerves controlling breathing, making each breath require conscious effort. In severe cases, the venom affects cardiac function, causing irregular heartbeat and elevated blood pressure. Children and elderly individuals are particularly vulnerable. The mortality rate for untreated deathstalker stings in high-risk populations can reach 20%. 1 in 5 of those stung without medical intervention will die, usually from cardiac or respiratory failure. Throughout the 20th century, scorpion stings were a routine hazard of Egyptian archaeology. Flinders Petrie documented over a dozen stings among his crews. German teams at Amarna reported frequent encounters. Italian excavators at the Valley of the Queens kept antivenom on site, a standard practice by the 1930s after several near-fatal stings. Modern excavations include scorpion protocols, visual inspections before entering chambers, protective clothing, including thick boots and gloves, first aid training specific to scorpion stings, and antivenom kept on site. But scorpions don't respect modern safety measures. They're still there, still hiding in the same cracks where they've lived for thousands of years. They're still perfectly camouflaged against limestone, their pale coloration making them nearly invisible until they move. Some tomb guardians are very much alive, small enough to fit in spaces a human hand can barely reach, patient enough to wait motionless for hours. Armed with venom perfected over millions of years, the ancient Egyptians built their tombs to last for eternity, to protect the dead through stone and seal. They couldn't have known that nature would provide additional guardians. That evolution would craft perfect defenders that need no instruction, no payment, no loyalty. They simply live in these spaces and defend themselves when threatened. Ancient warnings carved into stone, inscriptions that promise divine retribution for those who violate the tomb, that threaten the wrath of gods and the destruction of the violator's name and family. These texts are famous, copied in museum catalogs, referenced in documentaries about ancient curses. But read more carefully, read between the poetic language about divine vengeance, and some inscriptions describe something more practical, more deliberate, more grounded in engineering than theology. Architectural features that match the threats. Physical defenses that could actually kill intruders, not metaphors, not prayers. Descriptions of real mechanisms designed by human hands to punish human trespassers. The Abbott Papyrus, housed in the British Museum and dating to around 1110 BCE, is one of ancient Egypt's most fascinating legal documents. It records the investigation of tomb robberies in the Theban necropolis, a wave of systematic looting that had become so severe the royal administration launched official inquiries. The papyrus is unique in providing ancient Egyptian perspectives on tomb robbery, including the experiences of the robbers themselves. The document describes not only the robberies, but also the obstacles thieves encountered and the injuries they sustained. One entry describes thieves triggering a falling of stones, not a poetic description, but a literal account of a ceiling collapse. Another passage references the collapsing of the way, suggesting a corridor that gave way beneath intruders. A third section mentions thieves who did not emerge whole, a euphemistic phrase suggesting serious injury or death. These aren't metaphors. These are descriptions of architectural defenses that actually functioned, that actually harmed or killed the people who triggered them, and archaeological evidence increasingly supports the papyrus accounts. Tombs from the New Kingdom show signs of intentional defensive architecture, corbelled ceilings designed with false keystones that appear structural but actually support nothing, positioned so that removing the wrong stone causes collapse of entire sections. Doorways with stone slabs balanced on pivots, held in place by props that could be knocked away. Passages with false floors concealing vertical shafts, not accidental features, but deliberate designs intended to trap, injure, or kill intruders. At the tomb of Horemheb, KV-57 in the Valley of the Kings, excavators in the 1980s discovered a passage section with a ceiling collapse that had clearly occurred in antiquity. When archaeologists carefully excavated the collapsed section, they found something that confirmed their suspicions. Scattered among the fallen blocks were human remains. Not complete skeletons, partial remains, a crushed pelvis, fragments of a skull showing trauma consistent with impact from massive weight, several finger bones and part of a hand, preserved because they had been trapped in a void between fallen blocks. These weren't people who had been laid to rest here. These were people who had died here, violently, crushed by falling stone, and whose bodies had been left where they fell. Bronze tools found among the remains confirmed the identity of these victims: tomb robbers. They had triggered the trap, removed the wrong stone, disturbed the wrong support, caused the ceiling section to collapse onto them, with the full weight of limestone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds each. At the tomb of Seti the Beefker, a vertical shaft carefully concealed beneath what appeared to be solid flooring contained a skeleton. The shaft was perhaps 15 feet deep, ending in solid bedrock, a dead end literally and figuratively. Bronze tools lay scattered beside the skeleton. The shaft wasn't accidental. It was positioned deliberately in a corridor where intruders would pass, concealed carefully, waiting for someone to step in the wrong place. The ancient Egyptians didn't build these defenses for modern archaeologists. They had a specific enemy in mind, tomb robbers of their own era. But archaeology doesn't discriminate. Architectural defenses designed to kill ancient tomb robbers work just as effectively on modern excavators if those defenses are still intact. 3,000 years later, the mechanisms still work when they haven't been triggered. The stone still falls when the wrong support is removed. The floors still collapse when weight is applied to carefully engineered weak points. The stone falls regardless of motivation. The floor collapses regardless of intention. And the tomb that was designed to punish thieves accomplishes that goal perfectly, even when the person it punishes is an archaeologist with nothing but respect for the ancient dead. Gigantic granite sarcophagi loom in the darkness of underground corridors, each one a rectangular monolith of polished stone. They're massive beyond what photographs can convey. Over 70 tons each, carved from single blocks of pink granite quarried in Aswan hundreds of miles away, transported to Saqqara through means that still impress modern engineers. They're wedged into corridors barely wide enough to contain them, positioned with such precision that in many places you cannot fit a sheet of paper between the sarcophagus and the corridor wall. The Serapeum at Saqqara is unlike any other Egyptian tomb or monument. It's a catacomb, a massive underground complex dedicated to the Apis bulls, sacred animals believed to be living incarnations of the god Ptah, worshipped during their lives and mummified with full royal honors upon death. Each bull was placed in one of these enormous granite sarcophagi, sealed in these underground galleries carved from bedrock. But visiting the Serapeum today, what impresses you most isn't the religious significance or the expense or even the architectural achievement. It's the geometry of impossible spaces, the feeling that you're walking through corridors that shouldn't be able to contain what they contain, that the physics of space and stone have been bent in ways that create constant, low-level terror. The sarcophagi are so large and the corridors are so narrow that there's almost no clearance. Moving through the Serapeum requires squeezing past these massive boxes, sometimes sideways, sometimes crawling beneath overhanging edges. You become acutely aware that there's no room for error, that if one of these boxes shifted even slightly, there would be no escape. The corridor is too narrow to run. The sarcophagus is too large to avoid. You would simply be caught between stone and stone, crushed by weight that was perfectly balanced for millennia, but has finally decided to settle. In 1851, French archaeologist Auguste Mariette discovered the Serapeum after years of searching. But the discovery came with a price measured in injuries and deaths as Mariette's team explored these deadly corridors. The excavation accounts mention an incident where a worker was passing one of the sarcophagi when the massive stone box shifted, not dramatically, just an inch or two, settling under its own immense weight. An inch was enough. The corridor was so tight that even a slight shift changed the geometry of space. The worker was pinned between the sarcophagus and the corridor wall, Not crushed immediately, the shift was slow enough that his body absorbed the pressure, compressed rather than broken. But he was trapped, unable to breathe deeply, unable to move. His colleagues worked frantically to free him. They used levers and wooden wedges hammered into impossible spaces, trying to shift the sarcophagus even slightly. It took over an hour during which the worker remained conscious, unable to speak because he couldn't expand his lungs enough, making sounds that conveyed his terror and pain more effectively than words could have. When they finally freed him, he collapsed. Crushed ribs, internal injuries, permanent respiratory damage. His chest had been compressed to the point that the cartilage connecting his ribs to his sternum never fully recovered, leaving him with reduced lung capacity and chronic pain for the rest of his life. It wasn't the only crushing injury at the Serapeum. Marryat's expedition logs reference at least 4 serious incidents involving the massive sarcophagi, and 1 fatality, a worker killed when a sarcophagus lid, being lowered for examination, slipped from its ropes and fell. The lid alone weighed several tons. When it fell onto the worker positioned to guide it, death was instantaneous. Modern engineers have installed supports and monitoring equipment throughout the accessible sections. Sensors detect if sarcophagi are shifting, even by fractions of millimeters. Steel braces have been installed where geological surveys suggest the greatest instability. But even with modern intervention, access to parts of the Serapeum is restricted due to structural concerns that cannot be fully addressed. The Serapeum doesn't kill quickly, it kills slowly, with the patient weight of stone and the geometry of impossible spaces. Stone weighing 70 tons, corridors barely wider than the stones they contain, foundations that have had 2,000 years to shift microscopically, and the constant awareness that human survival depends on stone remaining exactly where it has been for millennia. Passage after passage, chamber after chamber, a maze beneath the mountain that seems to have no end, that continues to reveal new spaces even after decades of systematic exploration. Every time excavators think they've mapped the extent of this underground complex, they discover another sealed doorway, another corridor that extends deeper into the bedrock. The tomb grows with each season of excavation, expanding in ways that make comprehensive mapping nearly impossible. KV5 is the largest tomb ever discovered in the Valley of the Kings by an order of magnitude. It contains over 120 chambers documented as of the most recent surveys, with more passages and spaces still being excavated. For context, most royal tombs in the valley contain between 10 and 20 chambers at most. KV5 is a sprawling underground city carved into bedrock, a labyrinth so extensive that even expedition leaders with decades of experience can still get disoriented in its deeper sections. It was designed to house the sons of Rameses II, dozens of royal princes buried in an underground complex that sprawls through the bedrock like roots from a great tree. Rameses II reigned for 66 years and fathered over 100 children. Many of his sons predeceased him, and KV5 appears to have been designed as a collective burial for these royal princes. It's also one of the most dangerous archaeological sites in Egypt. Dangerous in so many ways and for so many reasons that working here requires specialized training and constant vigilance. The tomb was known to early excavators in the 19th century, but was dismissed as insignificant, too damaged by flooding and too full of debris to merit excavation. Then, in 1995, American archaeologist Kent Weeks decided to re-excavate KV5 before road construction would have paved over the entrance. What he discovered was extraordinary. The tomb extended far beyond what early reports had suggested. As debris was cleared, sealed doorways revealed corridors leading to more chambers. Each chamber contained more sealed doorways. The tomb sprawled through the bedrock in 3 dimensions, with chambers on multiple levels connected by shafts and stairs. The deeper the team went, the more complex and more dangerous it became. KV5's hazards are cumulative and overlapping, creating an environment where multiple threats exist simultaneously. The floors throughout KV5 are unstable in ways that make every step a calculated risk. Millennia of flooding and debris accumulation have created false surfaces that look solid but aren't. Flood debris compressed and hardened over time into surfaces that appeared solid but were actually suspended over voids. Workers report stepping onto what appears to be solid ground, only to have it give way beneath them, dropping them into hidden voids. One excavator described it as walking on a crust, never knowing if the next step will be solid or if you'll suddenly drop through into darkness. The passages are labyrinthine in ways that create serious disorientation risk. Unlike most tombs which follow relatively linear layouts, KV5 branches and connects in 3 dimensions. Corridors turn at angles that seem random. Chambers connect to multiple other chambers. Some passages loop back on themselves. Several team members have gotten lost over the years, wandering for hours in the dark, low-ceilinged corridors, before finding their way back. The ceiling heights vary unpredictably. Some passages are tall enough to walk upright comfortably. Others require crawling, but the transitions between heights are often abrupt. You're walking upright, focused on your footing, and suddenly the ceiling drops to 3 feet or less. Concussions from hitting heads on unexpected ceiling drops are common enough that they're simply accepted as part of working in KV5. In 1998, a worker fell through a weak floor into a previously unknown chamber, dropping nearly 10 feet. He fractured his ankle and was trapped for over 3 hours in complete darkness after his lamp broke in the fall. In 2005, part of a ceiling collapsed without warning, while 2 archaeologists were working in a chamber. They had seconds to react, diving toward the walls. They escaped with seconds to spare, both bruised but alive. The tomb is still being excavated, still revealing new chambers and passages. Each discovery requires assessment of structural stability. Each sealed doorway might reveal a stable corridor or a chamber on the verge of collapse. Each floor must be tested before weight is applied. KV5 doesn't try to kill you. It doesn't need to. It simply lets you get lost in passages that have no clear organization. Lets you take the wrong step onto floors that look solid but aren't. Until the mountain decides whether you leave or become one more name added to the list of those who paid the price for exploring the largest, most complex, most dangerous tomb ever carved into the Valley of the Kings. We step back now, out of the corridors and into sunlight that feels almost unreal after what we've seen. These dangers aren't supernatural, no curses, no magic, just chemistry, stone, air, and time doing exactly what they've done for thousands of years. Toxic gases build in sealed spaces. Ancient spores survive in darkness. Stone shifts. Floors fail. Air thins. These tombs were made for eternity, not for visitors. And nature still guards them far more effectively than any myth ever could. And yet, we keep entering, because we're human, because we want to understand the people who built these places. But the truth remains. Some spaces were designed to stay closed, and they still remind us of that, quietly, powerfully, and without warning. Which danger surprised you most? The toxic air, the ancient fungi, or the unstable architecture? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more hidden history the museums skip, subscribe. We explore the shadows every week. Until next time, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, Egypt's most effective traps were never magical. They're simply what time leaves behind.